Hello, my name's Rob Hopkins from Transition Network, and I'm delighted to be able to join you here today in this way. So I'm going to talk a little bit about transition, about what it is, how it relates to food and its perspective on food, and then also to answer some very particular questions that were emailed in advance of doing this. So transition is something that started here in Totnes about 6 years ago, and which has since grown to be being tried with, I suppose, experimented with in thousands of initiatives now in about 40 countries. And really it's a bottom-up look at how to build community resilience, how communities can take the lead on that, and how community resilience can be a form of economic development. So it started really, I suppose, as an approach to the twin challenges of peak oil and climate change, and has since expanded to also look at the economic crisis, the debt crisis, which is unfolding increasingly around the world. And our take, I suppose, really is that we're coming to the end of the period where we can decouple our actions from the impact that they're having on the climate. That actually the scientists are saying if we want to avoid a 2-degree rise in climate, then we need to be cutting our emissions by about 10% a year starting now. I mean, that's an enormous challenge. That goes beyond vehicle efficiency and changing light bulbs. That calls for a really kind of radical rethink of how we do things and the scale on which we do things. The energy issue, peak oil, I think is no longer, has never really been about the idea that we are about to completely run out of energy. It's really the idea that we have reached the end of the age of cheap energy and all that has made possible. So essential within that is this concept of energy return on investment, that if you're a fox and you eat rabbits and you spend more energy chasing rabbits than you actually get from eating any of them, you're not going to be a fox for very long. And in the same way, extracting energy, in the 1930s from Saudi Arabia, we put 1 unit of energy in to get 100 units of energy out. By the 1990s, oil production, that had fallen to about 40 to 1. Now we're down to about 17 to 1. And there's a very strong argument that once you get to about 10, below 10, then actually economic growth becomes impossible, because you're having to put so much energy into extracting usable energy that you don't have the surplus in order to drive the consumer society that we live in. And also the debt crisis is just an unfolding thing which seems to be getting worse and worse. And so really what we argue is that there is no cavalry coming to the rescue of the places where we live. You know, there is no kind of enormous funding that's going to come in, and so on and so on. You know, so really a lot of it falls to communities to make this happen. And that's what we really put out initially as an invitation 6 years ago. What would it look like if communities around the world picked this up and led with this themselves? And that's not to say that we don't need government responses, that we don't need international government responses, that we don't need local government. We need all those things. But what a very vibrant thing like transition, or lots of other things like it, which fill that void between what you can do on your own as an individual and what your local government and national government can do. That bit in the middle is hugely untapped in terms of its potential. And that's really what we're starting to see now, what happens when people step into that gap and pick it up and run with it. So as I say, transition started out originally conceiving around peak oil and climate change, but has since really gone on to look at this idea of community resilience and what that looks like. And the analogy that we like to use is like the New Economics Foundation, about the leaky bucket. If you imagine your local economy as being like a bucket, and into that bucket come wages and salaries and government grants and so on and so on. At the moment, most of that money in our local economies pours out through the holes, through the leaks, through the supermarkets, through the internet shopping, through paying our energy bills. That money leaves and is gone. And actually, every one of those holes in the bucket is a potential local livelihood, a potential training opportunity, a potential business. At the moment, when the alternatives that we're being presented with are either more austerity, you know, the idea like a rose bush that if you cut it back hard enough it will somehow spring back full of life, or a sort of Keynesian model where we just borrow more money from the future and charge the credit card of our grandchildren more in order to try and replicate the kind of growth-based economy that got us into this mess in the first place. Neither of those two are really appropriate stories for local economies that really need to be able to be resilient in the times that we move into. And indeed both of those often actively undermine community resilience unless we're very careful. So at the moment here in the UK, the government's obsession with making growth happen again means that what they see as the best way forward is to unleash big business to make that happen, to remove red tape so that big business can make economic growth happen. At the local level, what that often means is a very deliberate undermining of local resilience. The sort of supermarkets, big chains coming into towns and cities and driving out the local independent businesses, which are actually the ones that give the local economy its resilience. So in transition, we talk about this concept of community resilience as economic development, that if we're actually able to make a local economy happen ourselves and drive that ourselves, that's really going to be a key economic force of the future. So and I'll talk a bit more about some concrete examples of that in a minute. So currently our food system is enormously oil dependent, all the way through the system, from farming to harvesting to processing and so on. And supply chains get longer and longer and longer, and globalization has made this kind of ridiculous food model the norm. So for example, every year the UK exports 1.5 million kilos of potatoes to Germany at the same time as we import 1.5 million kilos of potatoes from Germany. And this is happening with a whole range of different foods, dairy products, this, that and the other. And the recent scandal in the UK where it was found that a lot of budget beef burgers and beef products contained horse meat was blamed almost kind of, well, what do you know, with onto kind of onto saying, well, the food system and the food chain has become very, very complex. Well, that complexity is a product of having enough cheap fossil fuel in order for that to become something that makes economic sense. So I would argue that actually when we start to move towards a more resilient local food economy, something which actually drives food resilience in the place where we live, that's going to look quite different. It doesn't mean sort of putting a fence up around. When we talk about localization, it doesn't mean that we put a big fence up around our local economy, but what it really means is that if we can meet our needs locally, where we can do that, that we try to do that, kind of import substitution, if you like. And of course, when people talk about localization, there's a good form of localization, and then there's a really not very desirable one, what the academics call reflexive and unreflexive localization. So, you could imagine a very feudal form of localization that's run by the mafia, but actually what we're starting to see in transition groups as they start to put these new businesses in place is very much a reflexive kind of localization, which is based on social justice, which is based on equity, which is based on fairness, based on enterprise and entrepreneurship, these kind of things. So I'll give you a few kind of examples of those as we go through. But first thing, I wanted to address the first question that was sent in, which was about it says, Rob, given that our local transition network is calling for a GM-free region, what suggested roles do you think local universities can or should have in the establishment of such GMO-free agenda for the region? And what do you think is the appropriate place and role for the local transition initiative to engage all parties on the issue? It seems like a big task. Well, I was thinking about that, and transition doesn't take a particular stance on GM one way or the other, really. But what I wanted to talk about was something which is very exciting, which is happening here, and which probably by the time you see this will have been released and you'll be able to download as a PDF, which is called the Totnes District Economic Blueprint, Local Economic Blueprint. And now, I've been around the kind of localization movement for quite a long time, and what tends to happen is if Walmart, for example, wanted to come into this town here and open a store, they would be able to say, we will create 25 jobs and we will bring £1 million a year into the local economy. Those of us who are working for more local, more resilient economies, we don't really do that very often. I've never really seen that kind of a mapping of that economic benefit that could arise from a push for intentional localization. So at the moment, Transition Network is involved in doing 3 of these local economic blueprints. One for Totnes and Devon, where I'm speaking to you from today. One for Brixton, which is a neighbourhood, a very urban neighbourhood of London. And for Hereford, which is a county on the English-Welsh border. The first one to be completed is the one for Totnes, and I think it's a really, really exciting model which could address a lot of what's embodied in your question there. So what we did was for food, for energy, for the retrofitting of buildings and for care of the elderly, we mapped very carefully where all the money goes. How much money does this town spend on food every year? Where does it spend it? How much of that is spent with local businesses? How much is spent on food, drink, and so on? And when you can trace the money and the number of businesses that there are, you get a really interesting picture starts to emerge, and you can do the same for energy and so on. So specifically looking at food, we find that this town and its immediate kind of hinterland spends £30 million every year on food. Of which 20 is spent through just 2 supermarkets. 17 of that goes out through just 1 supermarket. So 10 million goes through our local food economy, and Totnes has a much, much stronger local food, possibly the strongest local food economy of any town in the country. So that's going to be much, much bigger than it is anywhere else. But that 10 million is divided between about 60 businesses here in the town. And we know that those businesses create more work for people, create more economic resilience and so on. But that £20 million that's spent through 2 supermarkets, it means that we now know that we can say if we can shift just 10% as a community of what we spend on food every year, that's £2 million in this economy that's not going anywhere, that's creating new businesses, creating new livelihoods. That's economic development. That's not some wacky idea about how we should all be more local. That's real money that could be coming into this town with a very, very simple shift in what we do. And I think within that, there's a really important idea, which is I went to Manchester last week to something called the Place Branding Conference, which is all about how different cities and countries brand themselves as, the city of whatever, in order to attract inward investment. We're the city of social enterprise, or we're the city of scientific research, or whatever. And that idea that inward investment is always a good thing. And actually, I think what we're looking at with the economic blueprint is starting to shift the thinking, because of course inward investment is important, but there's going to be less and less of it. And that sometimes that inward investment can actively undermine community resilience. So alongside that is the really, really important concept of internal investment, which is how do we get the money that we spend on a daily basis, on our food, on our energy, on our shopping decisions and so on, to actually make our community more resilient, create more work locally, support a culture of entrepreneurship in the place that we live. And that's the idea, I think, that's missing in the current discussions around that and around our economic future. So for example, in Bath, the city of Bath here, Transition Bath led to the creation of Bath and West Community Energy. And Bath and West Community Energy is a community-owned industrial and provident energy company which got some inward investment from a bigger energy company that enabled them to get started. But they've developed a model where in their first share launch, they got £750,000 invested in them by local people, and quite a lot of that was people moving their self-invested pensions into Bath and West Community Energy. So it's a really exciting model of internal investment driving the building of community resilience, and we can do the same thing around food. So the economic blueprint sets that out in a way that I've never really seen anybody do before. And in terms of a way of bringing different bodies together, which was part of your question, one of the key things that has underpinned the blueprint is the fact that it's not a publication of Transition Town Totnes. It's a process that we facilitated, but the final document is being published by the local Chamber of Commerce, the Town Council, the District Council, the local college, the local school, a whole kind of coalition of local partners who've been in that process from the beginning. That's something really, really powerful. They've been involved in those discussions. They're now thinking, yeah, that shift of 10%, what would that look like? What's our role in that? How can we use our procurement? How can we use our purchasing decisions? How can we use our investments in order to drive that shift, that 10%, with a target of we could bring £2 million to Totnes without having to write any grant applications? That feels like a really, really important idea to me. And so then some of the things that are starting to come out of that, for example, Transition Town Totnes's work more recently has been very much about how do you create a culture of entrepreneurship in this town to drive that local economy. As I said, we are the cavalry. Who else is going to do it? So we run a local entrepreneurs forum once a year where we bring together people with exciting ideas for new businesses, with local investors, with people who could potentially mentor them, people who have experience of working in business that they would like to share. We do a Green Dragon's Den at the end where people present their business ideas and get advice and feedback. One of the things that's come out of that, for example, that I'm involved with is a craft brewery for this town, which doesn't actually have a brewery at the moment. Well, it has a very small microbrewery in one pub, but we're looking at something which would become an employer in the town, but really looking at what would a brewery look like as a social enterprise? What would a brewery look like if it were a catalyst for this shift to the 10%, if it was about helping to create a culture of entrepreneurship? So we're looking, for example, at brewing a limited edition of different beers which are related to somebody in this town who wants to start a business. So if, for example, Dave wants to start a patchwork farm growing herbs on 20 sites through Totnes, and he needs £5,000 to get his business started, then maybe we'd do a beer called Herbal something or other, or Dave something or other, that would come out, and on the label it would say, this is Dave, he wants to start a business, 10 pence from every sale goes to enabling that business to get started. People in their daily shopping build up a portfolio of enterprises they can start to see happening around them that they know that they have enabled to happen. It's like the idea of impact investing, which you hear about a lot. You know, we could move to a form that's real impact investing that you see every day you walk around the place that you live. And the beauty of it is that rather than maybe focusing on the GMO issue, which can be very divisive, actually if you can focus on community resilience and bring all those organisations together and focus on identifying the size of the prize, if you like, of this push towards intentional localization, that's a really powerful way to proceed, I think. The place where a lot of transition groups get started is with food projects. It's the place where when your group comes together and you've got started and you want to get started doing practical projects, that actually food projects, you don't need to wait a long time for permission. You know, you can get out, you can start things going. And so groups start with things like in London, in Kensal to Kilburn, Transition Kensal to Kilburn, their first project was to plant a food garden on Kilburn Underground Station. They're now the first underground station in London with food growing on it. In Norwich, they started something called Farm Share, which is a community-supported agriculture scheme, now has 100 members on the edge of Norwich. And that farm has become a real kind of focal point for a lot of that kind of work. In Stroud, they've started something called the Food Hub, which is a really innovative model for bringing local food available at affordable prices to people who otherwise would see local food as something a bit exclusive and something that would be outside their budget. And the idea works that they've developed this very simple software program where anybody can enter anything. So if you're a farmer and you've got 2,000 leeks that you need to sell, you can enter 2,000 leeks. If you're Mrs. Jones and you've made 40 jars of plum jam, or you've got 5 cauliflowers in your garden that you want to sell, you enter those into the system. And then when you go shopping online, you just shop as you would normally. And then as the person who's selling it, you know everything that you've sold. So then there's one day every Saturday in the local school where you turn up to collect what you've ordered, and all the producers bring in everything which they know that they've already sold. So it takes the middle out, so it makes local food much more affordable and becomes a real kind of social focus as well. Another exciting business, I think, that's come out of Transition Norwich again is called Hodmedods, and what they found was that in that part of the country, to have good organic rotation, you need to have a year where you grow legumes. And at the moment, most of those, the fava beans are one of the best ones there, which up until the 1500s were one of the key staple foods here. And at the moment, they're still grown, but they're usually exported to Egypt, where they're a real delicacy, or they're fed to cattle. So they've started to experiment with getting people growing those again and then selling them in really imaginative ways with little recipe booklets, that kind of stuff. And you've got places as well where transition groups are setting up new shop businesses, setting up kind of food link businesses where they act and they try and match up farmers with people who might like to source their stuff. There have been some very good can wherever feed itself studies where they map the land around and how it's currently used, how much food is needed and what level of import substitution might be possible. So the approaches that transition groups take to food can go from anything from let's start a garden over here growing some lettuces, to really thinking very strategically about how the region is going to feed itself, how the town's going to feed itself, and then putting in place some of the key enterprises that will need. To go to another of the questions that you sent, so you said, could I describe what were the key factors that made Transition Town Totnes such a success, and did local food play a role in that, and if so, how much? I think Transition Town Totnes started 6 years ago now, and I think there are some aspects of what we've done that have been really successful. Sometimes people come to Totnes and expect they're coming to a kind of green Shangri-La, and there'll be goats grazing on the roofs and no cars and everybody cycling around on bicycles. And it's not like that. We are an organisation working within an existing community, trying to nudge it in a particular direction, I guess. And there are some things that have been very successful in that, and a lot of things that you wouldn't necessarily see. So sometimes people say, well, I came to Totnes to see the famous Transition Town Totnes, and you still have cars, and actually a lot of what happens kind of runs underneath the surface. So we're now in a position where there have been about 40 projects that have spun off of TTT. I guess over that time we've brought maybe about £1 million into the local economy. Lots and lots of people, visitors. Some awards, that kind of stuff. But I think most importantly what we've started to do is change the story that the town tells about itself. It's a kind of a cultural process rather than an environmental process. It changes the way people think about what's possible. This idea of resilience being not so much about the ability to withstand shock as being the degree of possibility which you manage to breathe into the community where you live. And so that when you encounter shock, when you encounter difficulty, well, what are the possibilities that you feel that you have at your fingertips? And that feels like some of the most important work we can be doing, really. One of the things that's been really useful in answering that question about how transition works when it's successful is something that comes from transition training, in which they call the dognostic, which is where you could think of your transition initiative as being like a dog, and it's a really good tool for looking at how transition is successful. So the idea is that in order for a dog to be healthy, it needs to have 4 strong legs. So those strong legs are awareness raising, that you on an ongoing basis are continuing with awareness raising and telling people why you're doing this and bringing them the latest information about why it's so important that we do transition. That there are practical projects, that it's not just a kind of a thinking shop where everyone's sitting around, but that people are actually able to see tangible change and tangible benefits happening around them that they're able to feel part of and get involved with and put their energy into. Networking and partnerships, that actually linking up with other organisations and forming good relationships with them where it's appropriate is really, really important. And then the last of the 4 legs is developing an organisation, so developing a structure to underpin that, which is based on good group work, that the group is able to work together, that the processes are really good, and that it's kind of set up in such a way that it supports people. But then, like any dog as well, it needs to be able to see where it's going. It needs a vision. It needs to be able to look ahead. It needs a vision of where it's going. And then lastly, do you know that this is a process that's working well? How can you tell that it's thriving, that it's a happy process? So that idea of the tail is the tail wagging. What's the level of personal resilience? And so those things, quite often it's a very useful tool to do with people, because they'll say, yeah, well, we're good at this, we're good at that, but actually we haven't done any awareness raising for 4 years. Or actually we haven't paid any attention to how this group is working, how that's working, or actually we've just been focusing on process and on so on. We haven't actually done any practical projects yet. So making sure those 4 legs are in place of awareness raising, practical projects, networking and partnerships, and developing a sound organisation, good groups, are really, really important to this whole thing working. And in Totnes, to more or less to an extent, it feels like we've done that. And the trainings that we've developed here for other places are really built on enabling people to do that. Move on to the third question. It says, we've come to believe that the future of our local food sovereignty will only thrive and truly come about when the community takes responsibility for its food. What are your thoughts or experiences with the community taking responsibility for its food? Well, I guess I guess for us, that economic blueprint has been a real focal point for that, actually, in identifying the role that everybody can play with that. And I think it's really important to be mindful of the fact that, you know, what we've come up with here, when we start thinking about how do you make that shift to the 10% for that £2 million into our local economy, when you start really looking at the practicalities of that and talking to people about it, you know, there is that real perception among people of, you know, I've got a family of 4, I've got a very limited amount of money coming in, I can't afford local food, I have to shop in a supermarket because it's the only way that I can actually feed everybody, you know, which is absolutely an entirely reasonable perspective, and increasingly so as budgets get tighter and tighter. But of course, then the downside of that is that then the more money you spend in the supermarket, the more money leaves the community, the less likelihood is that there are going to be people who are going to be able to earn livelihoods and so on. It becomes a kind of a vicious cycle. And all too often, those kind of buy local campaigns tend to not really address those issues, and tend to be kind of, well, let's print a load of cloth bags with buy local written on it, and print some nice stickers, and make everybody feel guilty about the fact that they aren't buying locally. And so what we're looking at is something where, well, how do you turn that into an opportunity? So then what would it look like if actually you had a campaign that really focused on saying, okay, there is some stuff that you would be buying that the local economy can't compete with, but let's look at the 10% in your shopping basket that you could inevitably find cheaper through local businesses. And training people in how to cook and use those kind of products. You know, it's a wider push, it's a wider exercise, I think. So another great example of communities taking responsibility for food is a town called Todmorden in Yorkshire, where they started a project called Incredible Edible Todmorden, where they grow food everywhere, outside the police station, all up the high street, on any bit of vacant ground. They now have something there they call vegetable tourism, where people visit Todmorden to come and see this. The only rule about planting stuff is that the understanding is anybody can help themselves to it within reason, as long as it's kind of sensible harvesting. That kind of rethinking of our urban fabric is a really, really important part of this. I think, you know, creating food as part of our everyday experience of travelling through the place where we live. We have a version here in Totnes which is called Totnes, the nut tree capital of Britain, where we're planting productive trees through our parks and along our streets as a kind of a food security project as well. I think one of the things that underpins the question is the thing that we're seeing increasingly around the world now, of countries buying land in other countries in order to grow food for them. And I think this is a very worrying trend. And it's something which is about, I think, the thing that often comes up in transition and in localization, which is about building food resilience in a range of different settings. So if we're trying to make our local economy more resilient in terms of food here, then sometimes the argument is, what about farmers in Kenya? But generally, I think if an economy is exporting food on a large scale, something has often gone quite horribly wrong previously. And actually we should be looking at building food resilience in both of those places, rather than undermining it in both of those places. So in terms of cities that are very, very hungry for food, that are then requiring land to be bought in other countries in order to supply them with food, I think it's really good to work with them to look at the whole question of urban agriculture, the potential of cities becoming productive spaces and feeding their citizens through food grown in the city, which is huge in some places, and which has enormous potential for that whole issue of building food resilience. So the last question was about local currencies and their role in the local food system. Well, we started the Totnes Pound here in Totnes in 2007, I think it was, just as an experiment. We saw an old 1810 Totnes banknote and wondered what it would be like if we printed some new ones. We had 18 shops who agreed they would take them, and we just printed 300 notes, facsimiles of the 1810 one. That went really well, and then we introduced the Totnes Pound as a different note, and then that went really well, and we're now into our third issue, but we still only have a £1 note here, and we're about to launch, I think in July this year, a 1, a 5, a 10 and a £21 note, because you can, well, why not? And other places then picked it up and followed. So Lewis did the Lewis Pound, Stroud did that one, did theirs. I think where it's really started to take off in a very interesting way actually has been both in Brixton in London and in the city of Bristol. So the Brixton pound is they have a printed currency which is fantastic. They have David Bowie on the £10 note, for example, and they're much more beautiful and funky than sterling could ever be. Taken in many hundreds of shops in Brixton. But what they have as well is a pay-by-text system which Transition Network developed together with New Economics Foundation and a Dutch organisation called Coin, which is a pay-by-text system where you can go into a shop and you text the shopkeeper and that's your transaction done. But it can only be used in local businesses. So they piloted that and they've been working with that in Brixton. Businesses can now pay their business rates in Brixton pounds. But then about 5 months ago in Bristol, which is a city of 800,000 people, they launched the Bristol Pound, the first one for a whole city. They have beautiful printed notes which are designed by the people of Bristol. And they have all the kind of security features and watermarks and so on that sterling has. But they also have pay-by-text system there, which is very sophisticated, beautiful point of sale stuff. They recently had an election and elected the first mayor of Bristol, George Ferguson, and in his inauguration speech he announced that he would be taking his full salary, £51,000, in Bristol pounds. And then when the Queen visited a couple of weeks later, the gift she was given from the people of Bristol was a presentation pack of Bristol pounds. History doesn't record whether she took offence at the fact that her head wasn't on any of them, and I'm sure there's a special room in the Tower of London reserved for people who produce money. But anyway, they got away with it. So they're really seeing that as something which is about supporting independent businesses and enabling local independent food businesses to prosper. So clearly, this whole question about how food localization can be driven by a local currency is still very emergent. But when you create a situation where food businesses, which are really thriving, and they've got lots of local currency coming in that they can then only spend on other local businesses, other local food businesses, that's a huge place to start. So any work that you do around that would be really helping to inform and contribute to that. So I'm sure I've kept you for quite long enough, and I hope this has been a useful contribution to your conference and to your discussions. And I'd like to thank the local transition group for their questions, and James Cook University for facilitating this conversation. If you want to find out anything else about Transition Network, have a look at transitionnetwork.org. You can find out the blog that I do is transitionculture.org, and I'm on Twitter at RobInTransition. I hope this has been useful and has given you a sense of some things that you can do. If you want to find out about the economic blueprint I talked about, if you have a look at transitiontowntotnes.org, I'm sure by the time you see this that will have been published. So thank you very much for your time, and enjoy the rest of your event.